There were new developments today in Mexico's continuing drug war. Government authorities discovered the bodies of 72 people believed to be migrants from Central and South America, dumped less than 100 miles from the U.S. border. If, as suspected, the migrants were victims in the continuing war between violent drug cartels, this would be the largest single casualty count since the government decided to take on the cartels in 2006. For more on all that, we go to Ana Paula Odorica, a journalist with Foro TV in Mexico City, and Eric Olson, a senior associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. Welcome to you both. Ana Odorica, tell us a little bit about what you know about the latest of what was found on this farm in Mexico, these bodies.
Well, as you say, it was 72 bodies that were found in Tamaulipas. It's a big body count, the biggest that we have seen since President Calderon started this fight. And it's impressive, but the most impressive thing is how these victims have been invisible victims. These trans migrants have been invisible victims, and suddenly this might put them on the map. These are people that have been continuously kidnapped. The National Human Rights Commission has a count. It's a little bit politicized, and it is not an official count, but they say it's been 9,000 kidnappings in the past 6 months. So it is a huge number, and these are invisible victims because since they come into Mexico with no papers, then once they're kidnapped, they don't want to denounce what's been happening. They just want to return back home, or they just want to go to the U.S. if they are able to do it. These 72 people, well, they are now more body counts in this fight against the drug cartels that the Mexican government has been fighting.
Eric Olson, expand upon that. How is this tied to the kidnappings, the murders, apparent kidnappings, apparent murders of these 72 and many others? How does that tie into the drug cartel violence?
Well, one of the phenomena that's happened is that drug cartels and organized crime has taken control more and more of the smuggling and trafficking in humans. The same routes they use to move drugs up and down the Mexican border, they can easily use to move people and traffic individuals. So more and more we see the business model of the drug traffickers expanding into other areas, not just trafficking of humans, but other forms of trafficking. They use the same routes, they bribe the same officials, and they create these corridors that allow them to move people north and south.
President Calderon, Eric Olson, declared war on these cartels in 2006. It's been 4 years, by some accounts 28,000 people dead. Is it working, his war?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to say it is working. I'm not saying that he's not trying hard, he's not dedicated to defeating them, but by all measures it's pretty difficult to say there's success when we see violence continuing to grow, and more important than violence, the real power of these cartels is growing and expanding into new areas. And so it's not a very successful experience thus far.
Ms. Odorica, we have also heard reports in recent days of a mayor of Santiago being assassinated by his own bodyguards. We have heard tales of people being found hung by bridges in resort towns. This seems to be spreading rather than being contained.
Yes, and what the government has been saying is that this spreading of the violence is a signal of success. They compare it to what has been happening in Colombia, what happened in places in the United States like New York, for example, or Washington, when they fought against organized crime. And what they're saying is that it takes at least 7 years of continuous and growing violence before you can see some success. Not everybody agrees, and many people think that the strategy is not working, especially it's not only something that has to do with body counts. Today we got the news about these 72 bodies, but also 13 local policemen from Tijuana were released because there was not a due process when they got caught, because they had nexus or links with organized crime. So I think police forces and having them become clean agents working for the government is the first thing the government has to work for.
You cover this all the time. How insecure is this making people who either work, live, visit these regions at this point?
Well, I think now there are some regions where the thing is, I would say, a code red. You have Monterrey, you have places in Tamaulipas, but especially, I mean, the northern part where you can see that there is a fight, the fight that has been signaled to be between the cartel El Golfo, and Los Zetas, and they're using regular civil citizens to have this battle become more vigorous. So this is ordinary citizens that are feeling this fight against organized crime, and they are really asking themselves, is this working, and how much longer till we see some good results?
Eric Olson, how much is public corruption a part of this problem, and how difficult does it make it for the government to do anything to curb this violence?
I think it's absolutely fundamental. All the polling suggests that people have very low confidence in their authorities. The latest surveys say nationally only 22% of crime is actually reported. 78% of people don't report their crime. They don't trust their authorities. And police officers around the world will tell you their job is immensely more difficult if they don't have the trust of their citizens and the constituents. So I think at some level that's really at the heart of this. People don't trust the authorities. Organized crime has penetrated the police, the judiciary, every aspect of government, and that's really got to be a part of the solution.
So is there any discussion being held about changing the terms of this drug war or changing the approach on the government's part? I'll ask you this, and I'd like to ask Ms. Odorica as well.
Yes, President Calderon agreed to a series of public dialogues in the last 2 weeks to discuss the strategy, to invite experts and citizens and international people to provide ideas, to think about how they can improve this strategy. You know, it comes late in his administration. People would like to have seen that earlier. It's hard to know if it will produce a change in strategy. He said for the first time during that discussion that he was at least open to a discussion about legalization. He personally has always said he does not agree with legalization, but he was at least open to that discussion. So there's some discussion going on in the media, in the public, about what to do.
Legalization, Ana Odorica?
Yes, as Eric says, the president did open the discussion. He did so through Twitter. He wrote in his Twitter account that he was open to the discussion, although he himself was against legalization of drugs. And this has opened a whole big discussion where most of the citizens, most of the population is against legalization, but still the coin is up in the air. And especially so if we see what's going on in the U.S., where some states are talking about legalization or depenalization, especially a place like California, which is our neighbor. And on some accounts, it would be impossible to ask soldiers and ask policemen to prosecute something that here is a crime and right next door is legal.
Right. Ana Paula Odorica and Eric Olson, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
As the violence continues to mount, even gathering the news has gotten dangerous in Mexico. We have that story from Yon Grillo of the international website Global Post. A caution, this report contains graphic material.
A Mexican reporter tried to do a stand-up in the northern city of Reynosa, but with bullets and grenades flying just below this bridge, he and the cameraman were forced to lie on the concrete.
Es un enfrentamiento entre fuerzas federales y delincuencia organizada.
Gun battles like this have become almost daily affairs in Mexico, as heavily armed drug cartels fight each other and the government over billion-dollar trafficking routes to the United States. Mexican networks and newspapers have to make some tough choices on this drug war. They have to decide how to tell the story, how much blood and guts to show the public, and how to protect themselves. Milenio, a serious-minded 24-hour cable news channel available to some 3 million families nationally, has broadcast some of the most extensive coverage. It has put out rapid and graphic reports of massacres, mass graves, and car bombs. News director Ciro Gomez Leiva says viewers remain very interested in the story.
The story that the country has lived in the last 4 or 5 years is the most important story in almost a century. There has not been another moment so difficult, so painful, so bloody, and so dangerous as the one we are living today.
Over-the-air channels, whose biggest news shows have some 2 million viewers, have also made the drug war the top story. All networks have paid a big cost for their coverage.
In the last 14 months, criminals have murdered one of our reporters. They held another reporter and cameraman, beat them up, and let them go after 3 hours. And they kidnapped a cameraman and held him for a week as a hostage. Facing this, as the one in charge of Milenio TV, I can't say nothing is happening. They talk about self-censorship. Well, that is true. Where they held our reporters, we haven't sent a correspondent back, and we probably won't. Who am I to send reporters to this place where they risk their lives? This is a war.
During the kidnapping, gangsters forced the channel to show homemade videos in which they tortured police officers. Federal agents eventually freed the abducted journalists, shooting one of the kidnappers in the leg. Following that, Mexican journalists marched to government offices protesting the violence. These photos are of media workers who have been murdered. In total, more than 30 Mexican journalists have lost their lives since President Felipe Calderón came to power in 2006 and declared a war on drug cartels. Such violence has made many journalists shy away from investigative reports, and in some towns, newspapers even failed to cover certain shootouts and massacres out of fear. However, most newspapers across Mexico still make the drug war the top story. Many also publish in their pages so-called execution meters, counting the number of people killed in drug-related violence. Mexico has a total of 340 newspapers, which together are read by about 10% of the population. On a recent visit to one of Mexico City's oldest and most upscale newspapers, Excelsior, which sells about 100,000 copies, editors were planning the next day's front page. They were leading with the kidnapping and murder of a city mayor.
We try not to just be a mirror of the violence. We also want to give the context and explain the consequences of this violence on the population.
Beltran says the paper is careful about its coverage of the most gruesome acts, such as the severing of human heads. It runs stories that address the violence, but don't try to sensationalize it as some of the other newspapers might.
We took some time to realize that the gangsters were using murders and beheadings to send a message to rival groups in the government and society. At first, we didn't realize that by photographing these scenes and writing about these scenes, we would fall into their game.
President Felipe Calderón recently met with directors of Mexico's big media outlets to urge networks not to give voice to criminals and to support his government crackdown.
La amenaza a la sociedad son los criminales.
The real threat to society, the true enemy, are the criminals, not the government, at least not in this case. The first step is to recognize who are the bad guys and the bloody ones of the movie, and those are the criminals.
Calderón urged the media not to run any videos or written messages by drug gangs. Analyst Jorge Chabat, a professor of international studies who's authored several books on Mexican security issues, says the media coverage has been a mixed bag.
There are some newspapers or TV or radio stations that have been very responsible. However, there are others that I think that have exaggerated a little bit. They have put the image of beheaded corpses on the front pages and all this kind of graphic violence, which basically does not help too much to explain what is going on. And obviously is going to just to satisfy the morbid curiosity of people. The criminals make all this graphic violence obviously in order to impact the public opinion. And the more attention you give to these incidents and to this violence, well, the happier the criminals will be. You know? And in some sense, some media are playing the role of supporting the criminals. They are playing the same game. No?
Back at Milenio TV, director Gomez Leiber says he would love to have newscasts with no reports of bloodshed, but has to keep reporting the conflict that rages on daily.
I have to cover it. These are the big stories. The country is living through a violent narrative. I can't understand when people blame this on the media. We are not the ones who brought this violence, and we are not the ones who can stop it.
Until there is peace on the streets, these journalists say, the Mexican drug war will be televised.
Finally tonight, intimidation and the drug war in Mexico. Ray Suarez has the story.
The appeal to the drug cartels from the major newspaper in Juarez was dramatic. What do they want from us? Asked the front page editorial in El Diario. That editorial and an open letter from the newspaper's reporters came 3 days after a young photographer, Luis Carlos Santiago, was killed and an intern seriously wounded as they were walking to lunch outside El Diario's offices. Santiago was the second journalist from the paper to be killed. Declaring the cartels the de facto authority in the city, the paper asked for guidance on what to publish and not publish. The editorial put into words what's already practiced among some Mexican news organizations in areas where the drug war is most intense. Nearly 29,000, including 30 journalists, have died in the past 4 years. The death toll in Ciudad Juarez on the Texas border is more than 6,000. For more, we go to Angela Cocherga, the Mexico bureau chief for Bilo Television. Angela, a dramatic thing in any case, but certainly on the front page of a newspaper. It is impossible to do our job in these conditions. What kind of attention is that getting?
Well, Ray, this really has stunned much of Mexico, and as you pointed out, along the border, that really is the common practice, is self-censorship to survive. Basically, what the Diario de Juarez did is spell out what's already happening in many newsrooms in these conflict zones where powerful drug cartels really are in charge of the coverage. The Diario asked, what can we print, what can we not print, and how do we keep our reporters and photographers safe? Mexico is stunned because it also pointed out that the Diario said that these cartels are, in fact, the de facto authority in this region.
Were they really asking for instructions from the cartels, or was this more of a dramatic device, a rhetorical device to illustrate the danger of the situation for their journalists?
I think both. We talked to the assistant editor of the newspaper, and he said, yes, they really were directing this comment to the Mexican drug cartels fighting over these key smuggling routes to Texas and the rest of the U.S. But he said also that they wanted to send a message to Mexico as a whole to show how desperate the situation is and really plea for help. And this situation is really kind of a drug war zone where even as they point out in regular drugs, in wars, conflicts, you have protection for journalists. And that is definitely not the case here in Mexico. So they said this was not a publicity stunt, that they really are serious about this message.
Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on in the rest of the country. Journalists have been killed in other places. Is this sort of self-censorship going on in the other conflict cities?
You do see this especially along the border in other states like Michoacan and, of course, Tamaulipas on the northern border. It's so bad that when there were running gun battles in the state of Tamaulipas bordering Texas, citizens had no way to confirm what was going on. They resorted to social media, Facebook, Twitter to tell each other, stay off this street or keep your children home from school. So, yes, this self-censorship really is a survival skill for journalists. A few years ago, another Mexican newspaper, Nuevo Laredo, took out a front-page editorial and said, we will no longer cover the drug war. We are going to remain silent because it's the only way to protect our reporters and photographers. That came after that newsroom suffered a grenade attack from drug cartels. So this is a reality throughout Mexico.
This declaration, this open letter to the drug cartels, was really dramatic in its anger, in its use of language. We don't want more dead. We don't want more injured or more intimidation. But it was also very tough on the Mexican government, saying it had provided almost no protection for media workers. Has there been any response from the government to this dramatic open letter?
We did this afternoon hear from a spokesman with the President Calderon's administration, saying they offered their condolences to the Diario for the photographer who died and the other one who was injured in this attack. But the spokesman also condemned this editorial, saying that by no means is there any reason for any group, especially a newspaper, to try and negotiate with criminals or try and form some sort of truce. The government said they are the authority and that this newspaper should dealing with the authority, which is the Mexican government. The assistant editor of the Diario then said to me that, well, if they are the authority, they need to demonstrate that with actions here in Juarez.
And there's no question that these attacks are intentional, that the 30 reporters and media workers who've been killed were the target of these attacks rather than just collateral damage in the violence that's gripping some of these cities?
These cases continue to be under investigation, and you do often see that some doubt cast by the state investigators on the journalist's role. Were they really attacked because they were doing something in their line of duty in their jobs, or was it some sort of personal situation? So you do see some effort sometimes to kind of cast these victims in a negative light. So the problem with many of these cases and throughout Mexico is that they often go unsolved and unpunished, so we often don't know the real facts of the case, and that may be the situation in this murder as well, Ray.
Angela, you travel frequently from the Mexican capital to the border region and back. Ciudad Juarez has gotten a lot of attention in these last few years, but is more of the country, is even the capital, becoming more like Juarez rather than the other way around?
You do see more murders spreading throughout Mexico. I mean, you even see some of these narco banners in Mexico City saying, you know, we're here, or threatening authorities. Right outside of Mexico City, we had 4 bodies hanging in the city of Cuernavaca, a very popular place for Americans. A lot of Americans retired there, kind of a beautiful city, but now at the heart of the drug war. Cities like Cancun, we heard last week a possible attempt foiled by the government with a narco group staging an attack to try and break some other people out of prison. So, I mean, this thing, by no means is Mexico a failed state, but there are these pockets of lawlessness and a growing concern away from the border that these powerful drug cartels are having an impact in other parts of the country.
Angela Kocherga, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ray.